Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with Omaha-born veteran New York City jazz pianist Paul Serrato. He opened up about the success of his latest 2019 CD Gotham Nights. This Omaha native's warmth and passion for composing, performing, and producing jazz is hard to resist, and he has had a long history with the avant-garde, contributing music to off-Broadway plays and creating his own forward-looking recordings. He's a longtime resident of New York and celebrates that urban landscape through all of his work. So get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
So again, Paul, thank you for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz, man. I appreciate it.
It's totally my pleasure. Thank you.
You bet. So let's start off with Gotham Nights. Give me an idea of what your vision for this project was.
Well, this was an assemblage of tunes that I had composed that were in my folio, if you want to put it that way. I'm always writing things, and I knew it was time that I was itching to do a new project. So, I said, okay, what tunes should I include? And I had to consider the logistics, because since I am now relocated in Omaha from New York, I wanted to do this with my New York musicians whom I've worked with so much in the past and recorded with and so forth. The guys who are on the record. We can talk about those guys. I wanted something, I was on short time to do this, to fly to New York and do this, because I also teach school, and I wanted something that was going to be interesting, exciting, but simple. It wasn't going to require a lot of rehearsal and preparation. So I looked through my book and I chose these tunes. I said, I think they're pretty straight ahead, and they're tunes which I know my guys can do. We won't have to rehearse them a lot, because we didn't have any rehearsal. I went into the studio. We had 2 4-hour sessions. Amazingly, or not amazingly, they cooked right away. I grabbed them out of my folio and took them with me.
Wonderful. Talk about the group of guys that you played with on this.
Yeah, totally a pleasure to do that. These are first-class New York club and concert musicians. We were a quartet, and on bass it's Hilliard Green, who's one of the busiest bass players in New York. He's worked with everybody you can just about think of. Similarly, Lloyd Haber on drums. And Warren Smith, master percussionist, he's on vibes on this recording. I like to tell the story of Warren because he was actually in the original orchestra for West Side Story. He played percussion on that recording. If you hear the original recording, you'll hear Warren on percussion, a master. And I was just so lucky to have these guys that, I called them up. I had to arrange this long distance. I had no problem doing that too much. I called them up. I said, hey, can we round up and do this, on such and such dates? Because I had to pick out the studio. And they were great. They're real great musicians. I said, yeah, we can do it. And everybody was amenable to doing it.
Wonderful. So let's get back to the beginnings of your life. You're from Omaha, Nebraska.
Oh,
Talk
boy.
to me about,
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hope I can remember. Okay.
Yeah, right. I don't hear that town mentioned that much and on all the jazz bios I've been through. But talk to me about your childhood, how you got into jazz, and what kind of got you into it.
Yeah, well, certainly. I started out, as an adolescent playing classical piano, Chopin, Debussy, all those guys, and I was probably 9 or 10 years old, and the family, it's kind of a fun story. The family had a big old Philco short radio, and you could get shortwave programming from Chicago on that shortwave station on the radio. In those days, everything was tubes, nothing was digital, of course. So I used to be a radio geek, and I would tune in Chicago, and I would hear jazz shows from Chicago. And as a classical trained pianist at the time, I started hearing recordings by the great pianists, Art Tatum and Errol Garner, and I was just so totally blown away because I hadn't heard that kind of piano playing, and I didn't know that it was possible that anybody not playing classical could actually have those kind of chops, And so that sort of started turning me around. I started going into my teacher and asking questions about, different ways of doing things, and I started to write at that time. So yeah, it was a result of the influence of what I was hearing on the radio shortwave from Chicago at that time.
Talk to me a little bit about how you started out in jazz. What was the first step for you, and how did things kind of steamroll for you?
Of course, as I just mentioned, I started hearing this music, and then I think it's really started. Let's fast forward. Once I moved to well, I was playing in the high school band here, and it wasn't jazz strictly, but that was my first experience playing in ensemble. But when I moved to New York way back in the late 50s, I began getting involved in performance activity in New York. I mean, since I was composing music at that time, and songs primarily, I was being asked to provide music for shows off Broadway, and then there were a lot of singers who were doing cabaret shows, which were very popular at the time, and they wanted musicians. So I started getting experience contracting musicians, getting bands together, and doing the arrangements for the music and the composing for shows and cabaret shows, and they always had the jazz influence, and some of those things that I composed for those shows, you can hear I've done covers myself of those tunes on subsequent releases, and you can hear the jazz influence even in the songs that I wrote and so on.
Did you always think you were going to have a life in music, or did you have other dreams?
I didn't think I'm going to have a life in music. I was living that life. I didn't really think about, I'm having a life in music. There was so much activity, and I was so busy in New York because that's the way New York is. I'd go from one thing to another. And, of course, then what happened was at a certain point down the line, as a result of all this energy and creativity, which was, going out there, I decided to start seriously recording. And recording, my own music with the guys that I was working with and all these shows and cabaret gigs and so forth. And then, I was getting a lot of gigs doing clubs as well. I mean, I did things, I don't think there's a club in New York at the time in the 60s and 70s that I didn't play in with bands. But decided to start my record label. This would have been back in, I just had a 30-year anniversary, my record label, 1989, 1991, and I began producing records and have continued to do so up until Gotham Nights this year.
Talk to me a little bit about that move to New York, coming from the Midwest and Omaha. Was it a culture shock? What was it like to move there?
No, that I knew. That I had decided that I did want to move to New York. So, it was a culture shock in a way, but a happy one, not unhappy. So what happened was, what took me there was I was accepted at Boston University, and so I went to school at Boston University for a year, and then after a year I moved on down to New York, and then I made that my permanent home. And that's where I started really performing and developing my arranging and composing skills and contracting skills and so forth. Educationally, I got my undergraduate degree in jazz composition and Latin music at Empire State College. They have a subsidiary, a school called Boyce Harbor for the Performing Arts, and it's in East Harlem, and it's a well-kept secret, America's best well-kept secret. It's a wonderful school, all for Latin jazz, and some of the greats teach there when they're not out touring. I got my undergrad degree there in jazz studies, and then later, after that, because at the same time I was working as educator in community college, and so I got my graduate degree in urban education from Adelphi University. So
recently you got some exposure by composing music for a film on HBO. Talk to me about that project and what it's meant for you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that was A couple of years ago, yeah, An American Family. Well, that's a story in itself. I always tell, younger musicians, I always tell them, hang in. If you got to hang in for the long run. You can't, you're composing and writing something today. Just keep doing it because you don't know, the payoff might not come for a long time yet. And you will continue to get paid off. Yeah, that HBO show, An American Family, which was a kind of a recycling of the original 1971 PBS series, An American Family. And at one of those episodes, which is kind of a iconic classic, episode 2, I think, takes place in New York, and a segment of it is the New York Underground Theater. I composed a score for that show, Vain Victory. In fact, it was just feted at Howell Gallery in New York a couple of years ago as a memorial tribute to that show because it was so iconic at the time. And I composed a score for that show, and one of the tunes in there called My Place Tonight was used in the recycling of it 2 years ago on HBO, and it was recreated almost exactly the way it was in the show in 1971. It's a good tune. I like it. I covered it myself on one of my records. I forget which one, a jazz version. It was sung in the original production, but I do it as a jazz version.
So if you were to come to Kansas City and play a live show here in, say, the next month or so, and you had to write up a PR release to kind of explain what you would do in front of a crowd, how you would want to make the crowd feel with your music, and what you would deliver, what would you say?
Oh, well, listen, our mission as musicians is to provide enjoyment and pleasure to audiences, and that's always been my intention, hoping that the music will bring enjoyment and pleasure. And I'm happy to say apparently Gotham Nights has done that because so far it's in its 4th month and it's doing quite well. So, when you do these things, you always, it's like you throw this music up against the wall. You say, you don't know what's going to stick or what's not going to stick, You just do it because you have to do it and you want to do it and you love doing it. It's stuck and it's sticking. And so it's obviously providing a lot of pleasure to a lot of people. And I find that extremely gratifying. That's really, of course, you like to get paid, but, the payoff really is if people are really enjoying it.
What was one of the first live jazz shows that you saw that really moved you?
Oh, gosh. One of the first, let me just put it this way. When I moved to New York, way back in the late 50s, I, believe it or not, I had an apartment about 3 blocks. Oh, you have to understand how New York is laid out, but about 3 blocks from Birdland. And I'm talking about the real Birdland, right, on 52nd Street. There's a Birdland now, but it's not the real Birdland. So I lived about 3 blocks. And so a lot of us had come down from college, and we were regrouping in New York and crashing together and so forth and so on. It was great, great life. So we used to go to Birdland like 3 times a week. You could do it. I don't remember. I think it was like $1.25 or something to enter Birdland. It was down in the basement, and you could sit at the bar, and you could stay there all night with one drink if you wanted to. And that was when I really first started hearing a lot of jazz. And then, of course, there were the other clubs, too, in New York. But, Birdland was my neighbor for a couple of years that I lived in that area.
So at this point in your life, in your career, are you happy with where you're at?
Well, I would... Yes, I am. There's always more. I have a lot of music that's unproduced, and I have a lot of more music that I want to record and produce. I also have some folios of song cycles, which I would like to have performed. So my thought is to get as much more music out there as I possibly can. in the various venues, including recording and live performance.
So tell me this, why do you love jazz?
You hear music and it resonates or it doesn't resonate. I don't know. That's a tricky question. I mean, I love the music. I mean, why do some people love Beethoven? Why do some people love Mozart? Who knows? You love the music, and then jazz too. It gives you a lot of creative freedom, and I guess even though maybe I wasn't consciously thinking of it, but the excitement, for example, of doing this recording, Gotham Nights, the excitement of doing that was going into the studio, and yes, I had the tunes. Yes, I had charts for the bass player and so on, and for the charts for the musicians, but you never know, at least when you're a jazz composer or arranger, you never know how it's actually going to be when the musicians, with their own personalities and their own life experience in music, start playing it. What they bring to it can take wonderful turns, unexpected, unpredictable. And that's the excitement for me as a composer when I write. I say, okay, this is how it sounds when I'm sitting at the piano writing it, and I'm hearing, okay, it could sound like this, that. But once I hear, the musicians interpreting it, and what they can do with although there's no trumpet player on this particular release, but the bass, what Lloyd Haber brings to the drums, the percussion, I was totally surprised. I said, wow, that's really good, or Warren on the vibes. Unpredictability of the excitement of unpredictability, done by musicians of great caliber who have tremendous creative instincts and imaginations of their own. Wow, that's a big speech, huh?
That's great. I love it. So, I love it.
Excuse me. What kind of windy?
No, you're good. No, you're good, man. So everything's going to come down to this. This is my final question. I want to know this. Everyone has a version or an interpretation of you, your family, your friends, your fans, colleagues, but you know yourself best. Who do you think you are?
Who do I think I am?
Yeah.
Oh, well, as based on we're going back, like saying what my educational background and my experience, my life experience, including up to the present moment. There's this theory that the brain. Oh boy, here I go. But the brain, can do many things. So I'm proud to be a musician. I'm gratified that I have a gift that I can write music and communicate that music with the public. On the other hand, I teach English as a second language, and I have a degree in that. And so I am a musician and I'm an educator. I use the right side of my brain and the left side of my brain. I'm very happy to be able to do that. And I think people, and many, all my musicians on all my that I play with, amazingly, they're all educators of one kind or another. They teach in the schools, and if you go to music schools in New York, at least, you'll find so many big name, well-known musicians teaching classes at the New School or Juilliard or wherever. Look, Wynton Marsalis, right? So it's not unusual for jazz musicians to also be engaged in education.
Yeah, absolutely. Seems to be a cornerstone. Paul, thank you for taking some time out from Neon Jazz. It's been illuminating. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. Hope I wasn't too windy.
No, I love it.
Okay.
I love it. We are always prepared for every set of weather pattern that comes through, so it's all good, man. For sure.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest cats in Omaha, New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to the great Paul for his time, his music, and the stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.